be seated. All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What we're going to do at this point is read the jury instructions to you. You can sort of take notes if you wish, but understand that we'll provide copies of the jury instructions for you when you begin your deliberations here this morning. Okay. The law governing this case is contained in the instructions that I'm about to give to you, and it's your duty to follow the law as contained in these instructions. You must consider these instructions as a whole. You must not pick out one instruction or parts of an instruction and disregard others. As I said, copies of these instructions will be provided for you when you begin your deliberations here momentarily. Now, the law presumes the defendant to be innocent unless and until you are satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt of his guilt. The burden is always on the state to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It is not required that the state prove guilt beyond all possible doubt. The test is one of reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt is a doubt based upon reason and common sense, the kind of doubt that would make a reasonable person hesitate to act in the graver and more important affairs of life. Now, you are the sole judges of the facts in this case. It is your duty to determine the facts from the evidence produced here in court. Your verdict should not be based on speculation, guess, or conjecture. Neither sympathy nor prejudice should influence your verdict. You are to apply the law as stated in these instructions to the facts as you find them, and in this way decide the case. Now, you alone are the judges of the credibility of the witnesses and the weight to be given to the testimony of each of them. In determining the credit to be given any witness, you should take into account the witness's truthfulness or untruthfulness, ability and opportunity to observe, their memory, manner while testifying, any interest, bias, or prejudice the witness may have, and the reasonableness of the witness's testimony considered in the light of all the evidence in the case. Now, evidence has been admitted concerning a statement allegedly made by the defendant. Before you consider such statement for any purpose, you must determine that the statement was given voluntarily. In determining whether a statement was voluntarily given, you should consider that it was freely made and not induced by promise or threat. Now, you must not draw any inference of guilt from the fact that the defendant did not testify in this case, nor should this fact be discussed by you or enter into your deliberations in any way. Now, you should consider each opinion received in evidence in this case and give it such weight as you think it deserves. If you should conclude that the reasons given in support of the opinion are not sound, or that for any other reason an opinion is not correct, you may disregard the opinion entirely. Now, an expert witness is a witness who, by knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education, has become expert in any subject. An expert witness may be permitted to state an opinion as to that subject. You should consider each expert opinion and the reasons stated for the opinion, giving them such weight as you think they deserve. You may reject an opinion entirely if you conclude that it is unsound. Now, each crime charged in the indictment should be considered separately. So for you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in death of a child under 12 years of age, as charged in count 1, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1. Stephen Casaus physically abused or struck Omaree Varela. 2. By engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused Omaree Varela to be placed in a situation that endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela. 3. Stephen Casaus acted intentionally. 4. Stephen Casaus' conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela. 5. Omaree Varela was under the age of 12. And 6. This happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. Now, for you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in death of a child under 12 years of age, as charged as an included offense of count 1, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1. Stephen Casaus physically abused or struck Omaree Varela. 2, by engaging in conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be placed in a situation that endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela. 3, Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. To find that Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard, you must find that Stephen Casaus' conduct was more than merely negligent or careless. Rather, you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of serious harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. A substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would recognize under similar circumstances and that would cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. 4, Stephen Casaus was a parent, guardian, or custodian of the child, or Stephen Casaus had accepted responsibility for the child's welfare. 5, Stephen Casaus' conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela. 6, Omaree Varela was under the age of 12. And 7, this happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. Now, for you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in death of a child under 12 years of age, as charged in the alternative to count 1, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, Stephen Casaus physically abused or struck Omaree Varela. 2, by engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused Omaree Varela to be tortured or cruelly confined or cruelly punished. 3, Stephen Casaus acted intentionally. 4, Stephen Casaus' conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela. 5, Omaree Varela was under the age of 12. And 6, this happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. Now, for you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age, as charged as an included offense of count 1, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, Stephen Casaus physically abused or struck Omaree Varela. 2, by engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be tortured or cruelly confined or cruelly punished. 3, Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. And to find that Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard, you must find that Stephen Casaus' conduct was more than merely negligent or careless. Rather, you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of serious harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. A substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would recognize under similar circumstances and that would cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. 4, Stephen Casaus was a parent, guardian, or custodian of the child, or Stephen Casaus had accepted responsibility for the child's welfare. 5, Stephen Casaus' conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela. 6, Omaree Varela was under the age of 12. And 7, this happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. Now, in addition to the other elements of child abuse intentionally caused resulting in the death, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant acted intentionally when he committed the crime. A person acts intentionally when he purposefully does an act which the law declares to be a crime, even though he may not know that his act is unlawful. Whether the defendant acted intentionally may be inferred from all of the surrounding circumstances, such as the manner in which he acts, the means used, his conduct, and any statements made by it. Now, you have been instructed on the crimes of intentional child abuse resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age, and child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. You must consider each of these crimes. You should be sure that you fully understand the elements of each crime before you deliberate further. You will then discuss and decide whether the defendant is guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. If you unanimously agree that the defendant is guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age, you will return a verdict of guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. If you do not agree, you should discuss the reasons why there is a disagreement. If, after reasonable deliberation, you do not agree that the defendant is guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age, you should move to a discussion of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. If you unanimously agree that the defendant is guilty of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age, you will return a verdict of guilty of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. You may not find the defendant guilty of more than one of the foregoing crimes. If you have a reasonable doubt as to whether the defendant committed any one of these crimes, you must determine that he is not guilty of that crime. If you find him not guilty of all of these crimes, you must return a verdict of not guilty. Now, for you to find that Stephen Casaus guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in death of a child under 12 years of age as charged in count 2, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1. Stephen Casaus medically neglected Omaree Varela. 2. By engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused Omaree Varela to be placed in a situation that endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela. 3. Stephen Casaus acted intentionally. 4. Stephen Casaus' conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela. 5. Omaree Varela was under the age of 12. And 6. This happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. Now, for you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age as charged as an included offense of count 2, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1. Stephen Casaus medically neglected Omaree Varela. 2. By engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be placed in a situation that endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela. 3. Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. And to find that Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard, you must find that Stephen Casaus' conduct was more than merely negligent or careless. Rather, you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of serious harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. A substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would recognize under similar circumstances and that would cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. 4. Stephen Casaus was a parent, guardian, or custodian of the child, or Stephen Casaus had accepted responsibility for the child's welfare. 5. Stephen Casaus' conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela. 6. Omaree Varela was under the age of 12. And 7. This happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. For you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in death of a child under 12 years of age as charged in the alternative to count 2, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1. Stephen Casaus medically neglected Omaree Varela. 2. By engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused Omaree Varela to be tortured or cruelly confined or cruelly punished. 3. Stephen Casaus acted intentionally. 4. Stephen Casaus' conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela. 5. Omaree Varela was under the age of 12. And 6. This happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. For you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age as charged as an included offense of count 2, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1. Stephen Casaus medically neglected Omaree Varela. 2. By engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be tortured or cruelly confined or cruelly punished. 3. Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. find that Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard, you must find that Stephen Casaus's conduct was more than merely negligent or careless. Rather, you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of serious harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. And a substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would recognize under similar circumstances, and that would cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. 4. Stephen Casaus was a parent, guardian, or custodian of the child, or Stephen Casaus had accepted responsibility for the child's welfare. 5. Stephen Casaus's conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela. 6. Omaree Varela was under the age of 12, and 7. This happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. Now, in addition to the other elements of child abuse intentionally caused resulting in death, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant acted intentionally when he committed the crime. A person acts intentionally when he purposefully does an act which the law declares to be a crime, even though he may not know that his act is unlawful. Now, whether the defendant acted intentionally may be inferred from all of the surrounding circumstances, such as the manner in which he acts, the means used, his conduct, and any statements made by him. Now, you have been instructed on the crimes of intentional child abuse resulting in death of a child under 12 years of age, and child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. You must consider each of these crimes. You should be sure that you fully understand the elements of each crime before you deliberate further. You will then discuss and decide whether the defendant is guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. If you unanimously agree that the defendant is guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age, you will return a verdict of guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. If you do not agree, you should discuss the reasons why there is a disagreement. If, after reasonable deliberation, you do not agree that the defendant is guilty of intentional child abuse resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age, you should move to a discussion of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. If you unanimously agree that the defendant is guilty of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age, you will return a verdict of guilty of child abuse with reckless disregard resulting in the death of a child under 12 years of age. You may not find the defendant guilty of more than one of the foregoing crimes. If you have a reasonable doubt as to whether the defendant committed any one of these crimes, you must determine that he is not guilty of that crime. If you find him not guilty of all these crimes, you must return a verdict of not guilty. All right, for you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of child abuse as charged in count 3, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1. Stephen Casaus bruised Omaree Varela. 2. By engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be placed in a situation that endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela. 3. Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. And to find that Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard, you must find that Stephen Casaus's conduct was more than merely negligent or careless. Rather, you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of serious harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. A substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would recognize under similar circumstances and that would cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. 4. Stephen Casaus was a parent, guardian, or custodian of the child, or Stephen Casaus had accepted responsibility for the child's welfare. 5. Omaree Varela was under the age of 18. 6. This happened in New Mexico on or between the first day of December 2013 and the 27th day of December 2013. For you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of child abuse as charged in the alternative to count 3, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1. Stephen Casaus bruised Omaree Varela. 2, by engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be tortured or cruelly confined or cruelly punished. 3, Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. And to find that Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard, you must find that Stephen Casaus' conduct was more than merely negligent or careless. Rather, you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of serious harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. A substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would recognize under similar circumstances, and that will cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. 4, Stephen Casaus was a parent, guardian, or custodian of the child, or Stephen Casaus had accepted responsibility for the child's welfare. 5, Omaree Varela was under the age of 18. And 6, this happened in New Mexico on or between the 1st day of December 2013 and the 27th day of December 2013. Now, for you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of child abuse as charged in count 4, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, Stephen Casaus burned Omaree Varela on the chest. 2, by engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be placed in a situation that endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela. 3, Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. And to find that Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard, you must find that Stephen Casaus' conduct was more than merely negligent or careless. Rather, you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of serious harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. A substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would recognize under similar circumstances and that cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. 4, Stephen Casaus was a parent, guardian, or custodian of the child, or Stephen Casaus had accepted responsibility for the child's welfare. 5, Omaree Varela was under the age of 18. And 6, this happened in New Mexico on or between the 1st day of December 2013 and the 27th day of December 2013. For you to find Stephen Casaus guilty of child abuse as charged in the alternative to count 4, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, Stephen Casaus burned Omaree Varela on the chest. 2, by engaging in the conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be tortured or cruelly confined or cruelly punished. 3, Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. And to find that Stephen Casaus showed a reckless disregard, you must find that Stephen Casaus' conduct was more than merely negligent or careless. Rather, you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of serious harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. A substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would recognize under similar circumstances and that would cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. 4, Stephen Casaus was a parent, guardian, or custodian of the child, or Stephen Casaus had accepted responsibility for the child's welfare. 5, Omaree Varela was under the age of 18. 6, this happened in New Mexico on or between the 1st day of December 2013 and the 27th day of December 2013. So for you to find the defendant guilty of tampering with evidence as charged in count 5, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, the defendant cleaned Omaree Varela. 2, the defendant intended to prevent the apprehension, prosecution, or conviction of himself or Cynthia Varela Casaus. 3, this happened in New Mexico on about the 27th day of December 2013. For you to find the defendant guilty of intimidation of a witness as charged in count 6, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, the defendant knowingly intimidated or threatened with the intent to keep via Varela from truthfully reporting to a law enforcement officer or any agency that is responsible for enforcing criminal laws information relating to the commission or possible commission of child abuse or tampering with evidence. And 2, this happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. Now, for you to find the defendant guilty of intimidation of a witness as charged in count 7, you must, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt each of the following elements of the crime. 1, the defendant knowingly intimidated or threatened with the intent to keep Esteban Casaus Varela from truthfully reporting to a law enforcement officer or any agency that is responsible for enforcing criminal laws information relating to the commission or possible commission of child abuse or tampering with evidence. And 2, this happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. So in this case, there are 2 possible verdicts as to counts 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Guilty, 1, and not guilty, 2. Only one of the possible verdicts may be signed by you as to each charge. If you have agreed upon one verdict as to a particular charge, that form of verdict is the only form to be signed as to that charge. The other form as to that charge is to be left unsigned. Now, your verdict must represent the considered judgment of each juror. In order to return a verdict, it is necessary that each juror agrees. Your verdict must be unanimous. It is your duty to consult with one another and try to reach an agreement. However, you are not required to give up your individual judgment. Each of you must decide the case for yourself, but you must do so only after an impartial consideration of the evidence with your fellow jurors. In the course of your deliberations, do not hesitate to re-examine your own view and change your opinion if you are convinced it is erroneous. But do not surrender your honest conviction as to the weight or effect of evidence solely because of the opinion of your fellow jurors or for the purpose of reaching a verdict. You are the judges of the facts. Your sole interest is to ascertain the truth from the evidence in this case. You must not concern yourself with the consequences of your verdict. I have one other instruction, and I'll do that after the lawyers have provided their closing argument for you. Who will be providing closing statement for the state?
I will, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, for the last week or so, you have heard the testimony about what happened to Omaree Varela. Omaree Varela was a 9-year-old little boy. He was loved by his siblings, but unfortunately for him, his stepfather abused him, his mother abused him, and because of the actions that both parents took, both of them, he is now dead. You heard the testimony in ways that where Nidhi talked about witnessing the harm that her stepfather, Stephen Casaus, caused. But you also heard the testimony how he couldn't be bothered to call for help as Omaree lay bleeding internally on the ground or on the bed, dying. And Stephen Casaus couldn't be bothered to tell the truth to the first responders in a way that may have had an opportunity to save his life. So what you'll see is that the defendant, who is here on trial before you, caused the death of Omaree in 2 different ways. The first, as it's charged in count 1, is that he physically abused Omaree. That he acted part and parcel with his wife, Cynthia Varela Casaus, in the kicking and the punching and the beating of Omaree. The second way, and as it's charged in count 2, is the medical neglect. And it's important to remember these counts are independent of each other. So even if you were to think that he was not involved in the beating of Omaree, you can still find him guilty because he didn't do anything to render aid to Omaree as he lay there bleeding internally. He was lying there, non-responsive, and what the defendant did is essentially doom him to die. By failing to call 911, by failing to call for aid, by failing to drive to the hospital, by failing to tell the truth once the responders were there, that medical neglect caused Omaree to die. Now you've seen all the evidence, and you'll have a chance to look at and review the evidence that's going to be provided to you when you go back and deliberate. And it's important to look at the different pieces of evidence. It's important to listen and watch the videos, and it's important to listen to his statement and see how his lies changed over time, especially as compared to the other statements that he provided. But there are a few things that I'd like to highlight here as part of closing. And the first is we're going to watch the lapel video. And this is the video that was done by Sergeant Edison as he was coming into the house. And it's important to look for a few things and be reminded of a few things as you're watching it. You look at the defendant's demeanor during the video. He has a very kind of lackadaisical approach about what's going on. And what's going on, as you see in the video, is Omaree is essentially either at death's doorstep or deceased when Sergeant Edison walks in that door. And Sergeant Edison is the only one in the home at that moment that is concerned about whether or not Omaree lives or he dies. So let's watch.
Albuquerque, where is he? Leave the door open. Where is he? Where is he?
He's right here, sir.
Which one?
Right here. He's right here, sir.
All right.
Yeah, I got him right here. He told me to call you. That's what he told me to do.
Can you back up? Bring back up. Hey, buddy. Hey, buddy. You find out what he did? Can you fall for him? Can you take the kids out of here?
Yeah. I need to check for my house. She said to give you the medication.
Right where they want you. 43, we're secure for 46. We're going to about find you more. He's unconscious but breathing. Hey, buddy. Hey, buddy. Hey, buddy. Yeah, I got a pulse. I got a pulse. Let's go. You okay, buddy? I need to step up. No pulse. I got no pulse. No pulse. I'm not feeling anything.
Good thing you guys are down.
stay here with him, okay? Stay here with the kids, sir?
Sergeant Edison was the only adult in that home that cared. He's the only one that acted with any sort of sense of urgency about what was going on. You hear the different lies that are being told by Omaree's mother, Cynthia, and you see that Stephen Casaus doesn't care in that video. What you do in these following two clips that is part of the lapel camera of Sergeant Edison is you begin to see the lies that Stephen Casaus is telling as they start to unravel. And so let's watch those.
Hey, with the kids and watch the kids, please, sir? Sir! Okay, I need you to hold on to the kids and stay here with the kids and try not to use the phone right now. Pay more attention to the kids than the phone. Thank you.
Get off the floor to look. Yeah, look.
What time did you get called? How long have you been here? Okay, was he already down?
Yeah, he was out. He was still actually, he was a little bit awake, and I was trying to get him to speak up, but I don't know how to do it. You know, I tried to get him to be able to breathe in his mouth, and I was trying to pump on his chest a little bit, but I don't really know how to do that, so I was seeing if I could get him, and then he was like kind of going in and out. And I just told her, I said, call me out, and he said, call me out.
And that was about 30 minutes ago?
When I got my son. Exactly.
Where's Cap? Just stand by, it's just, there's one back there with 3 kids. Okay, what's your name? Steve. So, Steve, is that your legal name? Okay, what's your last name, Steve? Spell it for me. Okay, Steve, so, and what's your date of birth? Okay, so, where were you today? Let me just ask the question, okay? Let me just ask the question. I don't want to hear about Casaus. So, what time did you go there and where? Okay, and so you were there until about what time?
Maybe like 30 minutes, 40 minutes. I would say I got there about like 2 o'clock, and then I got here maybe around 4, I'd say.
You got here about 4? Okay. And what did she say to you?
She just said that she was crying and hysterical. I had to calm her down, and I see the things on the bed, like coughing and gurgling, and she said, Omaree fell, something's wrong with him, David. And I said, well, let me see. And he was kind of coming out. I kind of got him to come out of it a little bit, so we thought everything was going to be okay, and then he was going like in and out of consciousness, and then she felt that again. I was trying to give him CPR, to blow in his mouth, to get his chest to keep breathing, and I put her oxygen on him, and he kept going.
Okay, and who are you to her? She's your wife. Whose kids are these? So her kids from a previous relationship? Okay, and you guys are married, husband and wife, or a relationship? How long have you been? Okay, and so is this her child from another relationship? Do you have any children together? So she has 3 children, these 2 plus the one that's injured. Okay.
She called you, you were at work or your friend's house? Okay, you were at work. She called your cell phone, right? Show me, what time did she call you? I don't even remember. Okay, it's on your cell phone, right? You can look on your cell phone. Okay. You can look at your cell phone and tell me what time she called you.
Okay, so what we're going to do, I'm going to hold on to your cell phone, and the text will probably run over one to see what's in the cell phone. But I'm going to just hold it for a minute.
In this video, you catch him in his first lie, where he says that he is out of the house. And you see that the first lie, when he starts talking about what time this happened, his version of events about when these injuries occurred go farther and farther back the closer to the truth that he gets. Because here he says it was 30 minutes ago. In his final statement, you'll hear that it happened around 12:30 or 1 o'clock. That he and Cynthia would have waited for over 3 hours until 4:30 before they finally called for help. You also see that this video helps catch him in one of his other lies, where he's talking to the police officers and he says, I didn't know where my phone was, so that's why I didn't call for help. He has his phone in the video. He's scrolling through trying to find the imaginary phone call from his wife. And there were multiple phones in that house, as you see in the photos and that were tagged into, for the phones that were tagged into evidence. There were at least 3 different phones in that house, possibly 4, because you see Cynthia on the phone at the beginning of this video. They collect a phone from the defendant at the end of this video. In the photos, you see that there is their house phone that is on their living room table, and that they also talk about finding the cell phone on the nightstand. Now, Cynthia's phone could be the phone that was on the nightstand, or could have been the house phone, so there might have only been 3, but there were at least 3 cell phones in that house. And so it's disingenuous of the defendant to say he didn't know where any phones were, when he has the phone and has access to the phone in that video, and there were plenty of other phones in the house if he had wanted to call 911. He also makes reference to his efforts, and at this point, it's unclear what those efforts were to try to help save and revive Omaree. But later, when you listen to, when you listen to his statement, or later when you go into deliberations and you listen to his statement, he will talk about the efforts that he gave. And he said he gave somewhere between 5 and 7 chest compressions. In a situation like that, that's not going to do much of anything. The paramedics talked about giving approximately 100 compressions a minute. And they did that for over 30 minutes before they got to the hospital. So they had to do over 3,000 compressions. In the grand scheme of things, his 5 to 7 compressions weren't enough. And the thing about this is, you notice from the very beginning on that video the immediate distress that Omaree is in. He is either already deceased or right at the edge when Sergeant Edison gets there. Both Dr. Upham and Dr. Ukpo talked about the progression that would have taken place to lead to Omaree to get to that point. Obviously, it starts with the physical abuse. Then with the slow bleeds from the blood vessels internally. And over time, due to blood loss, you would have noticed that Omaree would have been anxious. He would have seemed distressed. He would have been in pain and uncomfortable. Eventually, he would have led to some sort of, as he continues to bleed internally, and Dr. Ukpo says that demonstrates the amount of blood that he lost approximately 1/4 of his blood in a slow bleed inside his abdomen, that he would have eventually gotten to an altered mental status where he probably wasn't making any sense, to being unconscious, to finally to him dying. And he estimated, Dr. Ukpo estimated, that that would have taken a minimum of an hour up to several hours. And in that video, you notice the urgency of the first responders. They went on to talk about in their testimony before here in court that their extraordinary efforts that they tried. They tried multiple rounds of epinephrine. They tried doing everything possible, including the bag valve mask with the capnography. They noticed that there was a CO2 return, which can be indicative that the body might be trying to start pumping its blood again, might be starting to regain function. So they were doing everything they could to give Omaree a chance. They consulted with a physician, and they decided to take him to the ER, where they were still doing those compressions at 100 a minute and approximately 12 to 15 breaths a minute. And paramedic Winnicamp said they asked if this was at some point if that was a typical situation, but she said it's not a typical situation for an otherwise healthy 9-year-old boy to be in that state. They made it to the emergency room, and they again tried some more advanced medications and started they did some other tests. They saw some electrical activity according to Dr. Upham, but there was still no heartbeat. They did some tests. They tested his blood and noticed from the hematocrit and the hemoglobin that it was 1/3 of normal, indicating a large amount of blood loss. They noted the abdomen was distended, which is common for internal trauma. And they tried at the hospital for at least another 15 minutes, or approximately another 15 minutes, before they declared him dead. And when you look at the stories of the two defendants, they start with very similar lies. They start with the lie of the bouncy horse. They blame Omaree's younger brother, who was 2 years old at the time, for pushing him off the bouncy horse. He was about 2 years of age, and Omaree was 9. But they say he must have pushed him off the bouncy horse to cause these injuries. But the lie doesn't hold up. And as the questioning from the police and the detectives and everyone else, his story begins to unfold. But certain things remain true. Officer Cook and Officer Wright both said that that Stephen Casaus never seemed upset or concerned about Omaree. And this was all going on while Omaree was in the other room receiving CPR before being taken out on a stretcher and rushed to the hospital. If you saw that or knew that that was going on, you would have been distraught. You would have been heartbroken. You would have been...
Yes.
Person would have been distraught. A normal person would have been heartbroken. They would have been beside themselves. They would have been arguing with the police that you need to take me to the hospital right now so I can be with my child. But neither of his parents were doing that. Not Stephen and not Cynthia. They had no sense of urgency. And what they do is they try to make it seem okay to kick a child. They blame the victim. that it's okay because when there are different statements you hear that they talk about, oh, Omaree had behavioral problems. Oh, he wets the bed. Oh, he has ADHD. Like any of those reasons or excuses or justifications to physically abuse your child or to allow your child to lay on the floor bleeding to death and not get them help. Now, there are certain things that we know for sure that are certain in this case, and I recite them because they're important as part of the jury instructions. They are going to be important as they relate to these jury instructions because they're included elements at different points. In their opening statement, the defense essentially conceded that Omaree is deceased from blunt force trauma. He is dead because of the internal bleeding and the subsequent other causes, including the anoxic brain injury and him losing about a quarter of his blood volume. It's not contested that Omaree was 9 years old at the time of his death. And you'll note one of the elements is that he was under the age of 12, and so 9 years old is obviously under the age of 12. It's not contested that Omaree died on or about December 27th, 2013. That's one of the other elements. As well as that it happened here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's also one of the other elements. And on some of them, it's also an element that the defendant was a parent, guardian, or custodian of the child. And that's also not in dispute, that he was the step-parent, that he was the custodian and guardian of Omaree Varela. So it's important when we look at these charges that we're aware of them, and that we're aware that there are some of the things that are not contested. Because when you first look at these instructions, they can be a little bit confusing. Both of counts 1 and 2, it can be a little confusing because there are two different theories of how Omaree died. Both of them contain that the defendant, Stephen Casaus, put Omaree in a situation which endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela, as well as cruelly confined, or tortured, cruelly confined, or cruelly punished Omaree Varela. And so those are both alternate counts for both count 1 and 2. It gets a little bit trickier because when you're looking at it, there's also an included offense. Both of those, so you'll first look at what's called the intentionally causing the death of Omaree Varela for each of those. And you'll look at those at the top, and then you'll look at the included offense within it, which is that he either recklessly caused or recklessly permitted the death of Omaree Varela. And so it's important to note that there are both two intentional theories at the top, and they're alternate theories. So you'll look at these independently, you'll determine them independently, and then they both contain an included offense. So you'll first look at the intentional within each alternative account, and then you'll look at the included account. I'm trying to make this simpler. I don't know if I'm being successful at all, but their instructions are confusing. But that's the purpose behind them, and that's the purpose for when you go back and you look at them. You'll have these back there, so if it's hard to read on the screens, and this is from instruction number 2. The burden is on the state. It's our job to prove the defendant beyond a reasonable doubt. But it's important to know what a reasonable doubt is. And a reasonable doubt, you'll see in the second to last line, that a reasonable doubt is a doubt based upon reason and common sense. So when you're back there deliberating, the doubt that you have to have is it has to be a doubt based upon reason and common sense to make it some sort of, to go past the state's burden of a reasonable doubt. Now let's look at those instructions, and those instructions can be a little bit confusing. We'll start with the instruction number 10 for count 1. Now this is the intentionally caused instruction as part of count 1. This is that the defendant intentionally, by physical abuse or striking Omaree Varela, that he intentionally did that act, that he intentionally physically abused or struck Omaree Varela, that he caused Omaree Varela to be placed in that situation which endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela, that his conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela, and then you'll see the ones that are that there's not any disagreement about, that Omaree Varela was under the age of 12 and that happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. Now I'd like to just look at the other instruction, and this is the lesser included instruction for endangering the life or health of Omaree Varela. And that's probably too small for you to read. But this is the lesser included account. This is the lesser included count. And it talks about the defendant physically abusing or striking Omaree Varela and placing him in a situation that endangers his life or health. But the important thing to note is that in paragraph 3, that to find him guilty of this count, that it was a reckless disregard, that he was acting as a reckless disregard and he was recklessly permitting this action, you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of serious harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. A substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would have recognized under similar circumstances and would cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern and safety for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. This is the alternative. This is instruction number 12. And I'm just going to highlight some of the differences between the alternative to count 1 and the as charged count 1. In the beginning, it's in paragraph 1 or numbered 1, it still says physically abused or struck Omaree Varela, but where it changes is in part 2. That Stephen Casaus caused Omaree Varela to be tortured or cruelly confined or cruelly punished. Otherwise, it's going to be substantially similar to the other one. The difference really between the two different alternative theories is one is placed in a situation which endangered the life or health, and the other is tortured or cruelly confined or cruelly punished. And it's important to note those differences because you'll discuss the alternative theories independently. And when you look at him, you can find him guilty of both of them. And the way that what you need to remember and to look at and recall from the testimony as it relates to the defendant intentionally causing the death, that he participated in the physical abuse of Omaree Varela, and that he placed Omaree Varela in a situation which endangered the life or health, or he tortured or cruelly confined or cruelly punished. You look at the testimony that was here in court. And first and foremost, you have Nivi's testimony. She talks about the defendant participating in the abuse, that he was there with Cynthia, kicking, punching, hitting, that this was all going on and that the defendant was participating in these acts. He wasn't in the bathroom like he tells the police officers. He was participating in those acts. And that's important because it places him right there. She talks about how she saw Omaree having a bloody face. And you later hear from Kim Brown that he seemed remarkably clean. that there was no bloody fleece, and that, and I'll talk about it a little bit more as it relates to the tampering with evidence. But it goes to him affirmatively trying to cover up his tracks, trying to cover up what he had done with Cynthia in the physical abuse to Omaree. I'm sure the defense is going to try to blame Cynthia as being the primary actor in this, that Cynthia was the only person that was abusing Omaree. But they both had a duty. Defendant was aware of the abuse that was going on, if you believe just his story, and he had an obligation to help protect this child. But when they try to have you rely on just Cynthia's statement, you note that they're, in the limited versions of what you have from Cynthia's account, there are wide variations in that. There's that KOAT video that shows that that Cynthia said, "I kicked him the wrong way." But then you have the letters. And the letters that were read by, or with Sylvia Marquez. Defense is going to rely on the statements that Cynthia, both that were made to Detective English and that were played for you, and the statements to Detective Quillman. But those statements are the only statements she made. And in those letters, she is recanting what she had said. She's saying that the truth will come out, that Stephen's conscience is eating him, that Steve will suffer more, and that Omaree will not let him rest. And she says it wasn't her fault, but she takes responsibility for not doing more to protect Omaree. And there's also Detective English's concerns with the defendant's hands. They were very swollen. And her perception, when she's asking those questions, did you punch something? Why are your hands so swollen? Some of the other instructions that are important and we should also discuss are the ones as part of count 2. This is the medical neglect count. Count 2, again, there's going to be 2 alternative counts. The first is that he acted intentionally to place Omaree in a situation that endangered the life or health of Omaree. The second will be the same, the tortured, cruelly confined, or cruelly punished language. And both of them will also have then a lesser included, that you first look at the top of the first count, and then you look at the included offense of the recklessly caused. So let's first look at this one. And it says that Stephen Casaus medically neglected Omaree Varela. By engaging in this conduct described in paragraph 1, Stephen Casaus caused Omaree Varela to be placed in a situation that endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela. That he acted intentionally, that Stephen Casaus' conduct resulted in the death of Omaree Varela, and Omaree Varela was under the age of 12, and that it happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. The included account of this is going to be the one that's going to be hard to fit because it's a larger one. But again, it has that that language, that he acted with a reckless disregard, and that Stephen Casaus medically neglected Omaree Varela, that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be placed in a situation which endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela. And then the important language there in the middle of paragraph 3 that says you must find that Stephen Casaus caused or permitted a substantial and unjustifiable risk of harm to the safety or health of Omaree Varela. And a substantial and unjustifiable risk is one that any law-abiding person would recognize under similar circumstances and that would cause any law-abiding person to behave differently than Stephen Casaus out of concern for the safety or health of Omaree Varela. And he did both. Both for in both theories and in both the first count and the lesser included account, he acted intentionally for the medical neglect of Omaree Varela, and he acted with a reckless disregard about what happened to Omaree Varela. And it endangered his life or health. In his statement, and it's important to look at his last statement, when he talks about what happened, and I believe that the important part where to note is I think it's about an hour and a half into that video, where he talks about that he had gotten up and used the bathroom, and he took some heroin to get well, and then Omaree was down. His version of events is that he didn't participate. Nivi, and implied within Cynthia's version of events, is that he was there. But regardless of whether he was there or not, from that moment, at approximately 1 o'clock, he didn't do anything for the next 3.5 hours. And you heard from Kim Brown, who said that this child, that Omaree Varela, had more patterned bruises and injuries than any child she'd seen in the pediatric emergency room in what was about 13 years of service. Not only were the external injuries obvious, but there were signs, according to Dr. Ukpo and Upham, of him as he progressed from the internal bleeding, that he was getting worse and worse over that period of time. And the defendant didn't do anything. Dr. Upham says this would have been incredibly painful. Dr. Ukpo says the child wouldn't have been acting normally. He wouldn't have been wanting to watch TV. He wouldn't have been wanting to play. He might not have even been wanting to eat or do anything like that. He would have been in discomfort. And they let him be. They let him be in pain. They let him go through that process. And why? Why did they do that? There's a handful of reasons, some of which they state. They said that some of the reasons that he said for why he didn't get help immediately was that, well, he thought Omaree was faking. They thought Omaree was pretending to have these injuries. But it shouldn't have taken 3.5 hours to figure out that this wasn't a game. This wasn't Omaree faking. That he didn't know where the phones were. There were 3 or 4 phones in that house. And he found his fast as soon as the police officers arrived, as shown on the lapel camera. Well, he told his wife to do it. It's a long time to wait. 3.5 hours. He could have called himself. And when confronted by that, he says, oh, he panicked and he was paranoid. Which begs the question, why was he panicked and paranoid? He says that it's his wife at one point and he didn't want to necessarily get Cynthia in trouble. But your priority from the very beginning should have been Omaree. It should have been about keeping Omaree safe. Or was it about himself? When he talks to Nibby, he says, don't say anything. If you don't say anything, Daddy will be okay. You won't have to go anywhere. Those are the last few minutes of his recorded interview with the detectives. Listen to those. It says a lot about his self-preservation. His self-preservation on two fronts. The abuse to Omaree, and he probably didn't want the police there. He knew if they called 911 there would have been police in his home, and he was a drug user. He'd been using heroin that day, and they found drug paraphernalia in the bedroom where Omaree was. He was worried about himself, about getting caught for abusing this child, as you can see from the litany of bruises all over his body in those photos, about the abuse that day from killing Omaree, and from getting caught for the drugs in the house. Even he at the end says that he should have stepped up. He should have made the call. He should have been more of a man, that this was a child and that he should have done what was right. But he didn't. All right, let's run through some of the other charges. And again, with the medical neglect charge, you'll have the two alternate theories and the lesser includeds on each to consider. But count 3 refers to the bruising. That Stephen Casaus bruised Omaree Varela. And that this is that he caused or permitted Omaree Varela to be placed in a situation which endangered the life or health of Omaree Varela. You'll also see it charged in the alternative, cruelly confined, cruelly punished, or tortured. And that he was a parent or guardian. Omaree was under the age of 18, and it happened in New Mexico between the first day of December 2013 and the 27th day of December 2013. And when we're talking about the bruises, we're talking about not necessarily the bruises on his abdomen and back, because those are the injuries that would have led to his internal bleeding. We're talking about the other injuries, the injuries that you saw on his arms, the bruising on his legs, the bruising to his face. There's the abrasion, the part right under his nose, the right above his lip, the bruising on both arms and legs. Could have happened when he was defending himself, because as Nivi said, they were both doing it. They were both punching and kicking and hitting him. And that would have placed him in a situation which endangered his life or health, and it was also cruel punishment and torture. For count 4, it refers to the burns. It refers to the burns on his chest. Defendant admits to causing these injuries. He said it happened a few days prior. He says it was an accident, that it was running down the hallway and, oh, he must have he got him just like on the chest just a little bit. And you heard about these injuries. You heard from Captain Baca from the Albuquerque Fire Department that talked about that those looked like the types of injuries he'd seen where other people had put cigarettes out on their own body. They looked like cigarette burn marks. And he identified them as what he thought was a burn mark. Dr. Ukpo described them as healing thermal injuries. That when he looked at these injuries microscopically, the way that the body processes it, a thermal injury was different. And it was that flat nucleus, and I'm not sure about the rest of the science necessarily behind it, but that to him, it was obviously a thermal injury when he looked at it microscopically. So let's look at that injury. Help the glare a little bit. You'll have it back to look at. But what's important to note, there are 3 different injuries. Not 1, 3. Dr. Ukpo said that he would not expect there to be 3 injuries from one incident of running into a cigarette. And he talked about how a cigarette can be hot, and it wouldn't be uncommon for a cigarette to have caused 1 injury accidentally. And that's in part because it's painful. The child would have flinched, tried to move away, tried to back up. And then that's where defense asked Dr. Ukpo about the flying ember theory, that the tip of the cigarette would have had still been really hot and been flying around or falling down. But it would have had to defy kind of the laws of physics to get all 3. And no matter, and I'm not sure the proper aspect of it, but no matter which way the aspect of it is, if it was this way, it would have had to jump over to the side. And this way, it would have had to jump over to the side again. It would have fallen. Does not explain the 3 burn marks. And that's also charged both ways as cruelly confined, tortured, or cruelly punished, or placed in a situation which endangered the life or health. There's count 5. This is the tampering with evidence charge, and that the defendant cleaned Omaree Varela, and that he cleaned him to prevent the apprehension, prosecution, or conviction of himself or Cynthia Varela Casaus. You heard from Nibby that said that there was blood on his face. He had multiple injuries to his face. Any one of them could have had potential blood. There was the injury just below his nose. There was the injury to the abrasions and injuries to right above his left eye. And he could have had a bloody nose. All that blood, though, was washed away by the shower. They say that the shower was because they were trying to revive him. And people that try to revive people with like cold water or something, it's a quick thing. You're trying to shock the person. They said they put the child in there for minutes. If you're putting a child in the shower for minutes, you're not trying to shock the child with cold water. You're cleaning that child. You are trying to wash away any signs of injury that there would have been. Kim Brown, the nurse from the emergency room, says that he looked very clean. And she remarked upon it like it was shocking. Because as a 9-year-old boy, she wasn't expecting him to have come in that clean. There's no need to shower him for a minute or two, especially after they said they also had put ice on him to try to shock him with the cold. A minute or two was to clean him. You also note that when you walk in the lapel camera, he's just in his underwear, like he had been stripped of his clothes for his shower, to be cleaned. Count 6 and count 7 are both intimidation charges, intimidation of a witness charges. Count 6 is for Nivea, and count 7 is for little Stevie. And it's that the defendant knowingly intimidated or threatened with the intent to keep Omaree Varela from truthfully reporting to a law enforcement officer or agency that is responsible for enforcing criminal laws information relating to the commission or possible commission of child abuse or tampering with evidence, and that it happened in New Mexico on or about the 27th day of December 2013. And for this, you just look to the defendant's own statement. And again, that's the last few minutes of his recorded statement and what he says. Because at first he denies it. Earlier in the recording, he denies ever talking to the kids about what to say or what not to say. But at the very end, he says that he told them not to tell. He said, we just told them not to say anything, or we just told them to say nothing. He said it was because he was scared for himself and for his wife. He was scared for himself. It's also important to note the language that was being used. Everything will be all right. Daddy's going to be all right. Just as long as you don't say nothing, everything will be fine. It implies that he did something wrong, that he was part of the abuse, and that he's telling Nivea not to say anything and he won't get into trouble. He later adds, just don't say nothing. That way your daddy can be here and you won't have to go nowhere. Okay. And that's the threat. That you're going to be sent somewhere else. That you're not going to be with your family. That you're going to have to go and live somewhere else if you tell the truth about what happened. If you tell the truth about what you saw. And so that was the threats to Nivea. And what that does is it explains why it took her a while to talk about the abuse. She was afraid. She'd been intimidated by her father. She didn't want to talk about it until she was safe. When she does talk about it, she talks about it that she saw Omaree getting punched, smacked, and kicked by both of them, by mom and dad. She said she saw it happen because she came out of her room. She heard Omaree screaming for help. And the only person in that house that went to try to go to Omaree's aid was his little sister. And she says he didn't wake up because he was hurt. And even on the cross from the defense attorney, pointing out the time she had mentioned her mom hurting Omaree, when asked who hurt Omaree, she said both of them. In doing so, when she finally felt safe, she drew. Here's one of the many drawings that were entered in. She describes being, I am mad at you, Mom and Dad. We heard from her aunt that she was drawing all her mad here. That she was sad, mad, and not happy. And in the picture, you see 4 individuals. Mom and dad are smiling while they're kicking and standing on Omaree. And in her drawing, she has dad kicking the stomach, the mom kicking Omaree's head, and herself there crying as she saw what happened. You're also going to probably hear some different things that are red herrings in this case. And a red herring, this expression comes from back when poachers would use smoked herring, which would turn the color of the herring red, to try to throw the wardens and their dogs' scent off as they were trying to go poach. And they used the stinky smell to throw them off their scent. And so there's going to be some similar ways where the defense is going to try to throw us off. The first well, Stephen must have not done something wrong because he was released that day after talking to the police. That doesn't mean anything. What we know from that day is that it was a chaotic scene. The other defendant, Cynthia, admitted to what she did to her son while he tried to hide it. And they had listened to hours of the two of them talk about what was going on that day and saw many different lies about what had happened that day into the early morning of 12/28. And they let him go. But when they stepped back with some thoughtfulness, some deliberation, they realized that Stephen's story of lies didn't make sense. They had to go through the evidence. The autopsy hadn't even been completed at that point or even begun. They didn't even know the cause of death at that point, or manner of death. But when they stepped back and looked at it, they saw that the defendant had worked to thwart all attempts to save Omaree. He had done nothing to try to save Omaree. And he had worked to hide the truth. And that he was culpable and responsible for Omaree's death, just like Cynthia. And later, there were even disclosures by Nivi, the sister. And that combined with that reflection and her statements, he was charged. Kind of a subset of that, they're going to say that it was only because of some sort of media frenzy. But the media would moved on to another topic by the time he was charged 4 months later. New stories come up, new interests occur. For example, in this time frame, the shooting of the homeless man, the Boyd shooting, had taken place a month before. So it's not like there was a media frenzy just around this case. There were plenty of other things going on in Albuquerque and in New Mexico. Defense is obviously going to blame Cynthia, blame her for being the only actor in the situation and the only actor in the abuse. But just because she admitted to doing it doesn't exclude him from having any guilt. Both of them are guilty. Both of them participated in the abuse. Both of them refused to get Omaree help after he lay there bleeding. It's not that just one or the other. It's that they both are responsible for these actions. You see that they both end up trying to blame each other in the end, and they're both right. They may try to argue about a third kind of thing. It might be that they may try to argue about the precipitous drop that they heard from Dr. Akpo. This wasn't a description about what would happen. This is a possibility of what might have happened. And just hearing the term precipitous drop is a little out of context, because Dr. Akpo described that that Omaree would not have been in a normal state. He wouldn't have been wanting to watch TV. He wouldn't have been wanting to play, that he would have been in discomfort. And then you had that whole timeline of events of going from that discomfort, that anxiety, to altered mental status, to unconscious, to death. And you look to the defendant's own statement. He always describes Omaree as being down, as being out of it, immediately. He immediately knew something was wrong. That the child was there lying by the bouncy horse in the bed. By both his hands and Cynthia's. The other sort of red herring out there is the testimony from Dr. Penland. We heard from her yesterday. She was offering paid expert testimony, but she couldn't name a published article to support her theory. She provided us with an unpublished manuscript that was incomplete. It wasn't peer-reviewed. It was never subject to a double-blind study. And that one peer-reviewed article pointed out the ethical flaws in the study from the very beginning, that they hadn't received permission for the Human Subjects Committee. They cited other studies that it couldn't be repeated. But when questioned, she just said there were other things out there, but couldn't name one specific thing. What she did describe from her own experience, though, as a psychologist working with children, was that of delayed disclosure and how that happened. What she describes is the fear and apprehension, the fear of retribution, shame, and a child's age, combined with the abuse taking place within the family, all make it much more likely that a child would delay in disclosing any sort of harm, and that there would have been a security concern. Those are all reasons why a child like Nevi would have taken time before she talked about the abuse that she saw in that home. Because she was afraid and fearful, she waited till she felt safe to talk about the abuse. In the end, you look at the different versions of events. You have Cynthia's, where she initially takes blame and then starts to point the finger at the defendant. You have the defendant's, where he always is pointing the finger at Cynthia until the end of his statement, where he says, well, maybe I should have done more. I maybe should have done something. But ultimately, they both have a motive to lie, to protect themselves, to protect their interests. The only person that didn't was Nivi. She had no motive to lie, to make up a story. So based on her testimony, the testimony that you heard from all the different witnesses, from the medical experts, the paramedics, and the police, who also don't have any motive to lie, you should find the defendant guilty of all 7 charges and their alternatives.